This is Embodied from PRX and WUNC. I'm Anita Rao. Author Ruth Whippman can pinpoint the exact moment when she first felt scared about raising boys. It was 2017. She was nearly 9 months pregnant with her third boy, and the Me Too movement was taking off, with constant headlines about men's harmful behavior.
In my own personal life, I just had this kind of terror of, how am I going to raise these boys to be good if the world is telling them that this is okay?
That moment sent her on a journey to better understand the experiences of American boyhood, what was going wrong, and how she and other parents, including her husband Neil, could change the tides.
It's not sort of expecting immediate results around everything you're doing. It's sort of just trying to counter what I suspect is the dominant narrative they get, which is a very traditional narrative around what masculinity is and how they should be with their friends.
A new playbook for raising boys just ahead on Embodied. In late 2017, journalist Ruth Whippman was nearly 9 months pregnant. And every time she picked up her phone, she saw a similar headline.
Oscar-winning movie producer Harvey Weinstein says he is taking a leave of absence following a New York Times report alleging decades of sexual harassment.
Congressman John Conyers is increasingly isolated from his party and his biggest backers on Capitol Hill after multiple allegations of sexual misconduct.
Another meteoric fall from grace as tonight comedian Louis C.K. comes clean.
Ruth was already the mother of 2 boys, but it was when she was pregnant with her third boy, in the midst of this cultural reckoning with male power, that she felt a shift.
And I thought, hang on a second, this is really scary. I'm a feminist and I'd always advocated for the rights of women and girls. I thought a lot about the way that we socialize girls, but suddenly I was like, there is something seriously wrong about the way that we're socializing boys if this is happening on such a systemic level.
While on the one hand, Ruth was cheering on the Me Too movement, she also felt defensive of her boys and deeply uncertain about their future.
It almost became as though if you were progressive in that moment, you were on the side of women and girls. And if you were kind of conservative or on the right, you were on the side of boys and men. It felt like a zero-sum game. It had to be one or the other. And I just felt this can't be right. There has to be more to it.
This zero-sum game left her with a big open question. How could she raise her boys well with expansive possibilities without betraying her feminist principles? This is Embodied, our show tackling sex, relationships, and your health. I'm Anita Rao. This moment in 2017 set Ruth on a journey to better understand the experiences of American boys and how she and other parents could change the tides. Her research culminated in the book Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Although Ruth and her husband Neil grew up in the UK, they're raising their kids in California. So the first step in this journey was getting clarity about what was going wrong and further unpacking the cultural expectations around American boyhood.
I think I grew up with this idea that everything works great for boys and men. The system works great for them. They have all this male privilege. They have all this sort of access to power. And it's women and girls who are at this terrible disadvantage systemically. But that doesn't quite match up with the data as we see it. These statistics are almost becoming kind of a cliche at this point, but it's like boys are falling behind girls academically at school from kindergarten through to college. Around 60% of college entrants now are girls, and only 40% are boys. There's this failure to launch phenomenon where more boys than ever are just kind of living at home with their parents and not either working or going to college or finding a partner. There's a male loneliness epidemic. And when it comes to mental health, boys are really in crisis. They're nearly 4 times more likely to die by suicide than their same-aged female peers. So there's obviously something very wrong going on at a systemic level. This system is obviously not actually working that well for boys and men either.
You came to this term of impossible masculinity. How does that describe what boys are facing culturally in this moment?
the idea of impossible masculinity and using that phrase as opposed to a phrase like toxic masculinity was a very deliberate choice. I think partly because the phrase toxic masculinity is just quite off-putting for many people at this point, especially for boys and men. But also, I think that the idea of masculinity has become impossible really from all sides. Boys are still held to these very sort of old school expectations and pressures of masculinity. So they're still expected to be tough, to be strong, to be invulnerable, not to talk about their emotions, not to show weakness, to have this like pumped body. Those are kind of these expectations that boys feel are very hard to meet. There's this kind of constant feeling from many boys and men of being kind of a little inadequate in the face of those. And I think boys are often silenced when talking about their emotions or their feelings. But then on the other side, you've got this newer, more progressive take on the whole thing, which is, boys are toxic, boys are privileged, it's time to be quiet, it's time to shut up and let everybody else have a voice. So I think boys are being silenced a little bit from the left as well. And I think a lot of boys and men feel really sort of scared about speaking to their own experience, speaking to their own pain for fear of like taking up too much space somehow. So I think it just feels impossible for them in all directions. It's like, we don't know how to be. Are we supposed to be aggressive and dominant and make the first move and be a real man, whatever that means? Or are we supposed to be cautious and to be quiet and to shut up and be sensitive? And, these things feel irreconcilable, I think, for many boys in this moment.
So when you started talking to boys, you sought out boys and young men from all around the country of a variety of different races, ethnicities, demographics. What did you hear in those conversations about what they said that they need, that they're not getting?
So it was really interesting because you're right. I spoke to many, many boys from very different backgrounds, very different geographic locations, very different situations. And what actually really stood out was not really the differences in what they were saying, but more the similarities. If there were any kind of headlines in it, I think the main one was loneliness. Over and over again, young men and boys told me that they felt really lonely in this moment, really shut down and really lonely. And I think that came from a variety of different sources. Some of these boys were genuinely kind of isolated and weren't spending much time with other people. And that's a trend that you see in the data, that boys and men especially are spending far less time socializing in person with peers and far more time online. But a lot of these boys actually did have a lot of friends. They had mates, they had sports teams, they had people to hang out with. But they often felt that their relationships were quite superficial. Like they couldn't really show their kind of vulnerable, messy selves to their friends. They had to like perform this kind of masculinity and be competitive, be rigid, be funny, be a laugh. But they couldn't really share their deeper emotional selves. And I think a lot of them were crying out for that kind of connection. I scratched the surface with these people. First, they get on the phone, or, I meet them in person and they're all kind of posturing and I don't care. And by the end of the interview, they were just really revealing so much stuff about how isolated and lonely they felt and how they craved these deeper connections, but didn't really know how to go about getting them and didn't feel like they had the social permission to act in that way.
What you're saying there of not knowing how to go about getting that connection or go about building those relationships is kind of this thread that you really land on in your book, which is that teaching boys emotional vulnerability and teaching them the skills to be able to nurture those parts of themselves could be a really core tool in shifting the experiences of boyhood. Is there a moment or a story from your research that you think really illuminates that?
Yeah, I think it's one of these things that once you see it everywhere. I remember this one moment when I was actually in the bookstore with my 3 boys and we're looking at books and magazines, and I see this magazine that's on the shelf and it's very clearly aimed at preteen girls. It's got a pink cover and it's sparkly and there's like a friendship bracelet giveaway and all this. And it's like, boys, stay away. Do not go anywhere near this. And I open it up and the first story in the magazine is this story of this girl, and she's been invited to these 2 birthday parties that are happening at the same time. And she's really scared that she's going to like disappoint one of the friends by not going to her party. So she comes up with this whole scheme, and she's like, decides to like secretly run between the two parties and like go to do the games at one party, then sprint across around the block and go to the other party and do the games there, and then back to the other one for the cake, and then sprint back. And she just kind of exhausts herself with all this like emotional labor. And I was reading this and I was thinking, my boys will never see a story like this with a boy as the main character. You know, their stories are all about battles and combat and adventure, and there's always a good guy and a bad guy, and the good guy defeats the bad guy and he's a hero and a blaze of glory, and the other guy is like killed or defeated. You know, it's all enemies rather than like complex social negotiation. And you know, all of these things are fine. It's not like any one of these is better than the other, but I realized that boys and girls are getting very different messages about how to show up in the world, what friendship means, what their responsibilities are, what they can hope to get from human interaction. And I realized that we just are not teaching these complex relational skills to boys in the way that will lead to these very intimate, very involved relationships that girls and women tend to access more easily.
I want to point out that so far in this conversation, you know, we're using the term boys and girls. And what's particularly interesting about the moment that your boys are growing up in is that it is an era of more gender expansiveness. More and more kids are not identifying in the boy-girl binary. So why do you think it's so important to talk about the particular needs of cisgender boys in this context?
I think this is a great question. You're right that it seems like the idea of gender and the possibilities of gender have really just expanded for everybody in this moment, except for cis boys. If a kid identifies as a girl, if a kid identifies as non-binary, if a kid identifies as trans, we're really kind of reimagining all the ways that they can be in the world. But somehow that category of cis boy, you know, somebody who was male assigned at birth and still identifies as a boy, that category has just remained very, very rigid in terms of like how you can behave, what you can be, what you can think, what you can do. And we almost use this very inspirational language to talk about gender and empowerment. Say, you know, when it comes to girls, it's like, you can be anything you choose. You can, you know, rule the world. The future is female, which is wonderful. And I'm hugely in support of it. But then when we talk about boys, we use this very essentializing language. So it's like, boys will be boys. Boys can't sit still. Boys don't like reading. You know, boys are destructive. Boys are like dogs. All they need is food and exercise and throw a ball at them and they're fine. And so I feel like they're not getting the same sense of complexity about who they can be, that same sense of inspiration about different paths that they can follow in the world.
Just ahead, Ruth's husband, Neil, will join us to talk about putting Ruth's research into practice with their 3 sons. You're listening to Embodied from North Carolina Public Radio, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Ruth Whippman was pregnant with her 3rd son when she started to worry about American boyhood and began to rethink how she wanted to raise her sons. Ruth is an essayist and cultural critic, so when she couldn't find the parenting guidebook she needed, she set out to write her own. Ruth started talking to boys and young men around the country about their lives, needs, and relationships, and recorded her findings in the book Boy Mom: Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. One of her biggest takeaways was that to help boys thrive, we need to teach them complex emotional and relational skills and encourage them to be vulnerable. Ruth's book offers guidance for all parents raising boys, including her own husband, Neil Levine.
Each time I read a chapter, it sort of woke me up a bit to some of the things which I probably had taken for granted or just wasn't even aware of.
As Neil and Ruth incorporated new techniques into their parenting style, they also reflected on their own upbringings back in the UK.
I went to an all-boys school. I had, a family which consisted of brothers and male cousins. It was a very, very male environment.
Okay.
And, very little exposure to, some of the female interpersonal and relationship dynamics. And so, when we had boys, I felt very equipped. I mean, I know what boys like. I was a boy. I know what they like to read. I know how they get fun. And so, I was very much on autopilot, and it just wasn't even thinking about it particularly. So, it wasn't any conscious decisions were made once I had boys. It was just, I'm just going to do what I did. And, I know all of the variables in play here. So yeah, very, very unthinking, I think, as I went into this up until the point that Ruth started writing this book.
Do you remember when she first came to you with the idea and what your reaction was?
I don't think I remember the exact moment. Sort of, she was exploring the ideas. I think, as she mentioned, we had our third boy. And of course, there was a moment where, okay, is the third child going to be a girl? Then we discover it's not. And so really brought home sort of, look, what are the conscious decisions we're making with these boys now? I think also, the pandemic, where we're in lockdown and we're with the kids and we're sort of really engaging with them as every other parent was, 24 hours a day. And it's rough and tumble. It's high energy. It's very intense. There's lots of sort of play fighting and so on and so forth. So I think, there was certainly the pandemic, which was a catalyzing experience for sort of realizing just how intensely male the upbringing was.
Ruth, I want to go to you and hear about your own upbringing. Pretty different from Neil's. I know you were raised by a feminist mother. Is there a story that comes to mind that exemplifies her philosophy in parenting?
I mean, my mom was a classic second wave feminist. It was like no pink, no Barbies, there was this toy called a girl's world, and it was like this disembodied head that you could use to do like makeup and hairstyling. They look like
yes, I've
something from a
seen
horror
those.
film. Yeah.
Yes.
But, I desperately wanted one, and my mom would not allow it. And so I felt like a lot of things were kind of forbidden to me, but always we had this idea that like whatever girls were doing was not quite as good as whatever boys were doing. It was like what boys were doing was aspirational, be more like a boy, be anything a boy can be. And I see why that was. My mom, who grew up with fewer opportunities, she was born in the late 1940s, I think she wanted us to have exciting careers, to be ambitious, and that was the focus. And I think, the idea was that, what boys and men were doing was whatever we should be aspiring to do. And I pushed back on it. As a child, I was like, oh God, just give me the pink, give me the Barbies, please, I crave this stuff. Now I'm really grateful for it. I think it was kind of dogmatic because it had to be for those times. Now I'm like, incredibly grateful that she gave me that grounding in, believing in myself and thinking I could do more and being ambitious and all the rest of it. But it didn't have any room for discussion about maybe where boys are at a disadvantage, where it comes to intimacy or emotionality or connection. There was never a sense of like whatever we as girls want to do actually could be of any benefit to boys. There was never an idea that they could learn from us. It was always, the other way around.
I want to point out that this tension that I'm hearing in the way that you all are talking, which is that we're talking about kind of nature and nurture here. We're talking about, the ways that your mom was intentional about socializing you to believe that you could be anything you wanted to be. You can be anything a boy can be. And then I'm hearing in Neil's experience of those pandemic days of this feeling of like, we're around these boys and they're acting wild and like, what do we do about this? So,
yes.
I mean, and I know that this is a question that you have really wrestled with as a mother and as a researcher, this nature-nurture question. Can you tell me about what you found in the research and how it informed your thinking?
Yeah, so the book is a combination of memoir and reporting and research. And I think those two things were always bumping up against each other. So, I'm writing about my own experience and living my own experience and then seeing this research at the same time. And I think I went into parenting with this really kind of like hubristic idea that, I would just socialize them right. And then they would be the exact kind of sensitive, cautious, whatever sons that I of my dreams, that I had all this control. And then, of course, I had these three boys. They are every stereotype of boy rudeness. They are rambunctious, they're wild, they love play fighting, they love Nerf guns, they love, and my socialization felt extremely inadequate in the face of that. I was like, oh God, So I dug into the research, and it's really interesting because there are differences at a group level, and there will always be many, many, many exceptions. But at a group level, there are differences between boys and girls that are rooted in biology. But in a way, they're slightly different ones than the ones we think of. So when we talk about, innate differences, we're kind of like, boys are destructive, they're aggressive, they're naughty, they're rambunctious, they have energy, all of these things. But actually, what we don't talk about is that the data shows really clearly that by almost every measure, boys are more vulnerable, they're more emotionally sensitive, they're more fragile than girls, both emotionally and physically at young ages. And I think this can easily become a bit of a like double whammy. So it's like boys are more emotionally sensitive, they are more vulnerable, they need a little more. But because of our ideas about masculinity, we kind of give them a little less. And this shows up in the data as well. So it's like we handle baby boys and girls differently. We throw boys around and give them all this roughhousing, whereas we tend to give girls more like caretaking and nurturing touch, for example. We talk to boys less about their emotions and their feelings, and we talk to girls about these things more, and on and on and on. So we tell boys that they have to man up and be tough and be strong. So I think they get a little less of that kind of really nurturing, emotionally led care than girls do. And so what starts off as a small difference becomes really quite a big difference by adolescence.
So, Neil, I want to come to you and get into some of the practical aspects of this, how the two of you have taken these theories of wanting to cultivate more emotionality, stronger interior lives, more emotional vulnerability for your boys, and actually put it into practice. You have boys that range currently from 7 to 14. So is there a story that comes to mind or a specific example of a way that you have tried to do this for your boys?
So yes, there's definitely been things we've tried deliberately. So the stories we read, I still read to my 7-year-old at bedtime, and being much more conscious of the sort of variety of content he reads, and sort of not default to this sort of the more simplistic sort of hero stories that certainly I read when I was a kid is definitely one of them. And also just even with my eldest, just trying to spend a bit of time with him in the evenings, just chill out. There's no agenda, and just ask him how his day's gone, if there's anything he's worried about at school. So yeah, it's just being much more deliberate about finding those moments to have an emotional conversation with them. If they're available, you can't force it, obviously, but just, create the circumstances to allow it to come up if they're ready to discuss things.
When you talk about reading different stories, can you give me an example of one you're reading with one of your boys that maybe you wouldn't have thought to read before?
So the Ivy and Bean series is a good example that, I started reading it to my 7-year-old, and, it's very much about the relationship between these two girls and the things they get up to. And look, it's designed for, young elementary school kids. It's not a lot of sophisticated tales, but it's about friendship and how they upset their friends or the friends upset them. And it's not that I'm only reading that, but it's, ensuring that there's a blend of that alongside, the Harry Potter or, the other sort of traditional franchises, which you inevitably get drawn into as well.
What do you do when you are trying to create that space and your boys don't want to engage? Like, how have you figured out how much to push or how much to be in silence? Are there any examples that come to mind of that? Because I feel like that can be really hard when you're trying to encourage a behavior, but you don't want to overdo it.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's I wouldn't claim to be an expert at any of this at all, and you can't force anything. It's just, sitting in a room with no agenda, I think, is like a really powerful thing. There's so many times as a parent, you're going in to ask them about their homework or to tell them about, something that's happening over the weekend that we all have to go to. But it's just going in with no agenda and, just shooting the breeze and, just talking about something random to get the conversation going. And you can often then pick up if they're at ease, they're feeling happy, or if you can tell there's something, that's weighing them down, they're a little less responsive. And then you can probe and say, hey, if you sound a little down, or you seem a little quiet this evening. Is there something going on? Something you want to share? And, you let them, you can't force it, but at least they know you're there. And I think also the other thing is just for me to be a little transparent with them. If I've felt a little snippy during the day and I know they will have picked up on it, then I'll say, hey, I'm sorry I was like that earlier, but it's because of, something that happened at work, or, some other reason I've been feeling ill or whatever it is. And so just, to show them that I can also be emotionally communicative with them as well.
That's really interesting, and that feels like a notable shift. I know when thinking about my own parents, like there was a lot about their interior emotional lives that happened behind closed doors, and it took me until adulthood to understand what they were going through emotionally when I was a kid. And I think it's important to model that for kids. Ruth, I'm curious, like how you and Neil have talked about modeling your own emotional vulnerability and interior lives in front of your kids and how to navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real balance, isn't it? Because you don't want to burden them
Right.
with, all of your like terrible feelings or problems, if those occur. And I think it's finding a way to be authentically human with them. I think there's something about modern parenting that can get a little bit robotic. I think people are reading a lot of parenting books and it's like, here's your script for talking to your child about this, or here's your script for how to approach that. And I think I tried to strip that away and just be like, show up as my authentic self with them within reason, what's sort of appropriate for their age. We got to have a sense of humor about it as well. It's not like there's a way that this stuff can be so earnest and
Yeah.
it's like, now is the time to talk about our emotions and our feelings. And I think it's more like just seeding a little bit through the day, having them know that we're available for that we're emotionally open. I don't want it to be too heavy because then I think that can be really off-putting for kids as well. I don't want it to feel like a burden for them.
Neil, we did a show a couple of weeks ago about the challenges that men face with friendship in adulthood, not having many close friends, finding it really difficult to be open and emotional in existing relationships. And I'm curious about how you tried to help your boys nurture friendships, knowing what you know about the beauty of that emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, so it's actually a good example is when you hear on the grapevine through parents, and if some kid was ill, they weren't feeling well, or a relative passed away, or something that you hear that from other parents, and I would ask them, "Oh, how's your friend doing? I heard that today, their grandmother died, or they were ill," and sort of encourage them to sort of just become a little bit more emotionally curious about the state of their friends, and not just assume everything's fine and they can go in and joke around with them and do the normal things at recess, but actually, you should go check in on that person, see how they're doing. And sometimes, it's rebuffed. Oh, they're fine. I don't need to do that. And so, no, I'm sure, they probably really appreciate it if you asked, and you would appreciate the same thing too. So it's just, prompting them to be a little bit more curious. Again, you can't force this, but, just suggesting that these friends might have a reason or a need to sort of communicate about their emotional state, I think can often just wake the kids up a little bit to it.
That's a really interesting take on this idea of emotional labor that I think is talked about a lot in adult relationships. This idea that there is this kind of undue burden on women to carry the labor of writing the birthday card, checking in on the person who had a sick grandmother, making a meal train. And Ruth, I'm curious, like, how do you think about what do boys miss out on by not having that attunement and doing that emotional labor? Yes, it's a burden for one person to carry it, but what's at stake if boys don't do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because recently I feel like we talk about emotional labor as if it's like an entirely bad thing.
Yeah.
It's only a burden. And it can be, if you have to do too much of it and nobody else is doing it. But actually, that is the beating heart of human connection, is checking in on your friends, those little daily tasks, that thinking about other people's emotions, tracking them, feeling some responsibility for another person's emotional state. Not, in terms of it's your problem to solve, but just in terms of, checking in, taking care of others, thinking about others, being curious about other people's experience in the world. Without those, you can't have intimacy. And I think often in the conversation recently, we've talked about teaching boys to be more emotionally vulnerable, which is hugely important, but it's only kind of half of it. I think the other half is like what to do when somebody else is emotionally vulnerable with you,
Right.
receiving it, taking an interest, being the giver of, sharing those kinds of things with other people. So not just, dumping your emotions onto somebody else and expecting them to deal with them, but learning how to deal with other people's emotions. We need both in order to have connected friendships. And I think girls and women are taught those things in so many subtle ways, whether it's through stories, whether it's through books, whether it's through modeling, whether it's through just a kind of general cultural expectation. And I think we need to hold boys more accountable for those things as well. Neil did this wonderful thing. It's actually, for my birthday, was a couple of months ago, he had the boys sit down and write birthday cards for me. And, I think with boys and with men generally, it's just like if they sign their name, that's a bonus. Great. And, just like the lowest possible bar. And he was so good, Neil. And he said, okay, no, I want you to really write something nice and generous and long and involved and like coach them through it. And each one of them wrote a beautiful card. I was really surprised. They really, with a bit of coaching about why this is important, why it's going to mean so much to me, they wrote these cards, which I will treasure forever.
Oh, is there a line that stands out or one of the things they wrote?
Oh, God. Well, my eldest wrote this beautiful line, which I thought he'd written, "You will always have a place in my heart," but he'd actually written, "You will always have a palace all to yourself in my heart." Which I was like, oh, God, this is just like, I just burst into tears when I read it. And I was like, did you say place or palace? And it was like, palace. I was like, oh, amazing. So, it's just... obviously not saying that kind of stuff all the time, day to day, but I think it's just like really calling them out on it and saying, don't do a like rubbish job on this. Do like a real job, really think about that person and what they need.
And Neil, what is it like for you to coach your boys through that? Like, what do you say to them to help them understand the importance of conveying those emotions and being able to receive those emotions for other people?
I think it's nothing particularly complicated. It's just you're reminding them, when we're going out buying birthday presents, let's really think about what your friend would like to have, not the thing you would like to get yourself or the thing you think is cool. It's like, let's really think about, what are they into, what they like to do. And, it's just these gentle nudges to sort of remind them that, look, these people are your friends. They're your friends. You have the same sense of humor. You might be into the same things, but they have their own emotional interiority, and let's think it through as we're doing something fairly mundane like buying a birthday present. And look, a lot of the time there is pushback. Oh, Dad, it doesn't matter, or you don't know them like I do. And it's like, no, you're right, I don't. But try and see them as being a little bit more multifaceted and perhaps a lot of kids' relationships are. And again, it's not that it even has to have a direct impact there and then, whether it's writing a card or asking them to talk to a kid who's having some issues. It's just reminding them that there is something in there, and they may not be curious about it at this moment in time, but just making them realize that there is a depth to people that they can explore and they should be aware of, such that when they get older, hopefully it's just a bit more there in the background. Because as Ruth said, I think a lot of the way girl stories and whether it's that birthday anecdote that the birthday story anecdote Ruth gave, being aware that, listen, my kids aren't getting a lot of that constantly from the media, from their conversations at school. So just trying to put a little bit of it in from me as I'm parenting them. So as they get older, it's hopefully, it's diffusely impacting their understanding of their relationships later on in life.
Just ahead, we're going to talk more with Neil and Ruth about navigating the many influences on their boys that come from outside the home. And we'll hear about the transformations they've seen in their children as a result of parenting differently. As always, you can hear the podcast version of the show by following Embodied on your platform of choice. We'll be right back.
Every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe-nominated morning news podcast, we bring you 3 essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Today, we're talking with journalist Ruth Whippman and her husband, Neil Levine, about how they're parenting their 3 boys to encourage deeper relationships and more emotional vulnerability. Inspired by the research Ruth did for her book, Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity, Ruth and Neil now expose their kids to diverse stories about gender, point out limiting beliefs about boyhood they see or hear, and model emotional vulnerability as often as they can. But there's still the challenge that their influence only goes so far. There is the world that the two of them are building inside their home. And then there is the bigger world out there with conflicting messages about who boys should be. I asked Neil how he thinks about that tension.
This is true of everything in parenting. It's, what you do at home and what happens out in the world once they go to school or they're hanging out with their friends. And yes, I mean, the tension is it's inevitable. You can't get away from it. And so I tend to think of it as it's not programming. It's not sort of, expecting immediate results around everything you're doing. It's sort of just trying to counter what I suspect is the dominant narrative they get, which is a very traditional narrative around what masculinity is and how they should be with their friends. And so it's just this general sense of, look, I'll do the best I can at home to sort of model some sort of slightly different or more progressive understandings about themselves as boys, recognizing that there's, they're still going to be swamped with, the media messages and marketing messages and the standard conversations. But yeah, it's just, you hope that the message they get from the parents is hopefully still the most dominant or maybe pervasive message that sort of sits in there.
Yeah, Ruth, tell me about your thoughts on this and maybe the thread of what you write about in the book of trying to think about what you can add into the picture versus, take out.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult question. I think it's one that applies, as Neil said, to every parent in every situation. How can what I do at home carry them through all these difficult things that they're going to come up against? And I think he's right. You can only do the best you can. In terms of your question, I think, at least for me, I've tried to make it more about adding things in rather than forbidding things. Partly, I think that's probably a reaction to my own upbringing, where it's there are a lot of forbidden fruits, and those things then often tend to take on this added glamour. So, I don't want these things to take on this added attractiveness. So they can have the Nerf guns, they can have the screen time, they can have all these things. I don't want them to feel deprived, but it's just adding in these other things as well. Similarly with screen time, it's not about forbidding screen time. It's about prioritizing real world connection as well. I think it's just, and you don't want to be in a battle with your kid or to make them feel like they're your sort of big social project or something. And I think it's also at the heart of it about just building the best possible relationship that we can with the kids that we have, as ourselves. And I think that is the buffer. That is the thing that will carry them, hopefully, we hope and pray, through life, and the best defense against what is going to come at them from the world.
You spend a lot of time in your book, as we said, interviewing boys and men, hearing what their needs are. And you were really in search of where the spaces were where they could be deeply open and vulnerable with one another. And one of the more shocking parts of your book and revelations that you had was in these online groups of involuntary celibate men or incels. Ironically, in these spaces, boys were actually able to be really open with each other. You actually saw and heard a lot of emotional vulnerability in those spaces. What was happening in these spaces that allowed for that kind of connection?
If anything, this was the biggest shock of the whole process of writing this book. So I have a chapter about incels. And if your listeners don't know what incels are, they're these involuntary celibates, it stands for. And it's these boys who are, or young men often, who are lonely, they don't have sex, and they're on these online forums, which are often extremely misogynistic, extremely racist, extremely toxic in all kinds of different ways. It's kind of part of the manosphere that people talk about, the online manosphere. And these guys, often have a lot of trauma. They have a lot of pain. They feel rejected. They feel like they cannot meet these expectations of masculinity. And they're on these forums, which are some of the most toxic places on earth. I spent time in these forums and I was just I wanted to have a shower literally every time I, went onto one of these places. But what was really fascinating was that alongside all this toxic, horrible content that they were churning out was this real emotional vulnerability. And I went deep and interviewed a few incels themselves, over a long period of time. And what these guys were telling me was that these spaces actually provided them a sense of belonging and connection and this ability to be emotionally vulnerable in a way that they felt they could not be anywhere else in real life. So they talked about their mental health. They talked about feelings of depression, of loneliness, of suicidal thoughts, And I think they were seeking belonging and connection in these spaces. And this was what was so chilling, which is like, if we want our sons not to go looking for belonging and connection in the toxic manosphere, we need to provide it for them elsewhere. We need to provide that kind of listening, that kind of empathy, that kind of community in other spaces.
There's such a push-pull with talking about, internet culture and online culture, because there are ways in which you can find people that, you feel seen by if you're isolated in a particular place. But then there are also ways that you can feel people that you're seen by who reinforce certain ideas.
Absolutely.
So how do you think about kind of, I guess the role of online spaces versus in-person interaction for cultivating belonging in boys?
Yeah, it's complicated because there's all these trends that we're seeing that boys are replacing real world socializing with online socializing to a much greater extent than same age girls are doing. There's a decline in real world socializing for everyone, but this is a much steeper kind of decline for boys. And male spaces have often kind of migrated online. And it's complicated because it is a balance. I think for people who are really lonely, the internet does provide a lifeline. It does provide connection. I don't think the best thing is to just take that away from boys and, just cut them off, and because then often they'll have nothing. But at the same time, I think we need to work towards providing more forgiving, more generous spaces in real life. So I think in this sort of micro generation of boys that have grown up in the shadow of the Me Too movement, negotiating sex and relationships is so complicated and fraught. So I think for them, we need to extend boys some empathy. We need to help coach them through this difficulty rather than to kind of painting them as these villains who, or these sort of potential predators. I think we need to look at the complexity of this moment for boys.
It's interesting, Neil, I want to put this question to you, building off of what Ruth is talking about how, if we don't want boys to go to these spaces online to find belonging, we need to provide them alternate spaces. We need to provide them a compelling narrative that pulls them away. Are there examples of kind of spaces for belonging that you all have been trying to cultivate for your own boys outside of your family?
Yes, I mean, like all parents, the kids do want to do activities, and we're encouraging them to do activities. I think, in line with what we've been saying here, a lot of it is like ensuring they're social. There's a social element to it. So, even simple things like, Dungeons and Dragons, which our eldest does, and, it's really encouraging him to go to that, and supporting his interest, because it's a really social environment actually. Even at camps, encourage him to go to sleepaway camps. They might be a bit reticent and a bit nervous, especially when they're younger, but realize that this is a great place to build actually those relationships, which aren't just about being at school or, doing a hobby with a friend. It's actually, you're going to spend a few days, and it does build a different relationship dynamic. So I think it's just being conscious of, look, they do have hobbies, they want to do hobbies, but ensuring there's a good mix of the social in there, as well as, look, they want to play video games, they want to, just go and run around on a skateboard by themselves, ensuring that there are places where they're going to get that opportunity for social interaction.
Ruth, you have been on a journey throughout the process of writing this book and since publishing it, kind of talking through your feminism and your feminist politics. And in the book, you're really open and vulnerable about times when things felt like they were at conflict with one another, or there were points of tension for you. Where have you landed with your relationship with feminism today after going through this experience, meeting so many young boys and thinking through some of the kind of tough points in where your philosophy met the real world?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a complex question. The book opens, there I am, like 9 months pregnant, Me Too's happening. I felt like feminism was in conflict with the sort of raising good boys. I felt like maybe, that my feminist principles were like harming my boys. And I think the journey of writing the book really took me to a different place, which is just like, absolutely, we need feminism. And feminism helps boys and men. This same system of patriarchy, which is oppressing girls and women and holding them back and stealing their rights and all the rest of it, is also so harmful for boys and men. And, I wrote this line in the book, which was like, under patriarchy, boys and men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, which is human connection, human intimacy. And so I think, we're all victims of this thing together. These things are not in conflict with each other. I think feminism can help boys. And actually, I believe, we all rise together and we all fall together. This system is not helping any of us. So I do not believe those two things are in conflict at all.
I would love to close with both of you on some more stories of your boys and examples of some of the change or transformation that you've seen in them. And maybe we can start with your youngest son, 7-year-old Abe, who I don't feel like we've heard as much about. Curious for either of you if there's a story that comes to mind.
I can talk about something that happened yesterday,
Yeah.
in fact, which was, so Abe's a real sweetheart. And we were walking to school and he runs into this girl who's in 3rd grade, he's in 1st grade, and they start talking, and I'm like secretly earwigging on their conversation, and it was so sweet. And she said to him, how are you feeling? Because his older brother's going off to middle school next year, and she's like, how are you feeling about being the only person at the school in your family? And he's like, well, I'm excited, but at the same time, I'm nervous and I'm a little sad, and a lot of different things all together, and they're all coming together. And she's like, yeah, it's really complicated. And he's like, I often feel that way. And it was like this really kind of emotionally involved conversation. I was suddenly like, wow, this stuff that often you feel like you're just banging your head against a brick wall and nothing's going in. And then suddenly I heard the way he was talking to her and I was like, oh, you are getting something from this. You are able to articulate these complicated, conflicted emotions. You do feel comfortable talking about it. And it was a really heartening moment. And I think this speaks to the thing we were saying earlier, which often isn't this one-for-one direct thing. You say, let's talk about your emotions. And they're like, thank you, mother. How great that you brought this to my attention. I will be different right from now. It's these little things that then come back much later, So that was one example anyway of Abe.
I love that. Neil, are there any stories that come to mind?
Yeah, it's not directly about Abe, actually, especially when he was 5, 6, he was having tantrums. It's not uncommon with small kids, but especially when you're the youngest of 3, and life can seem very challenging a lot when your brothers are getting things that you can't. And, his tantrums are pretty, completely epic, as most parents know with 5 and 6-year-olds. And I remember, both actually, the 2 eldest boys going, why is he like that? God, he's so spoiled and he's always having these rages. And I said, look, it's because he's the youngest and he sees you going off. You traveled by yourself for the first time internationally, or, your other brother went off on the bus to go buy some things. And, he sees this and he gets really frustrated and upset. And maybe you can just, be supportive and try and give him a bit of time and patience, because he's he feels in a very different place to you do, and that's why he's angry. And I think you could see this immediate change in the next few days of being a lot more sympathetic, not being quite so dismissive of his tantrums, but sort of trying to engage with him a bit more. So I think Abe has certainly helped the other two sort of become just a little bit more aware of the emotional state of certainly their sibling, and hopefully others too.
I love that. I'd love to end on any kind of advice, or it doesn't have to be advice, but it could just be kind of reflections about other parents. You mentioned earlier, Ruth, this is a moment of kind of intense parenting culture. There's a lot of pressure to get things right, to do it the right way, to not, harm your kid, or to prevent harm in all ways possible. And it's intense and it's a lot. I'm curious about kind of advice that you all have from your own experience of navigating that pressure to get it right while also just, kind of doing your best, doing the best that you can.
I mean, I can speak to the question about other parents. I think that, we've got this idea maybe, and maybe there's something slightly misogynistic in it, which is moms are always judging other moms and moms are in conflict with each other. That has not been my experience at all, actually. I feel like all of the parents that I know, which generally tends to be moms, but also dads, we all want the same things for our kids. Ultimately, we might have slightly different views on how to get there, or slightly different approaches, or the rest of it. But I think ultimately we all want the same things. And I think, I have found so much support and connection from other parents, and we're all trying to figure it out. We're all navigating the same stuff. I don't think anyone feels particularly sure in what they're doing in this moment, or If they do, great, good luck to them. Tell me what to do. But, yeah, I've found that other parents can be a great resource. And usually, that's a great way to form connections yourself as well.
Neil, any closing thoughts? And maybe you could even frame it as advice for your past self. You've now done 14 years, 14 years of parenthood. Any coaching to Neil from 14 years ago?
I could write a whole book about it, but I leave the book writing to Ruth here. The great thing about reading this book, although it's called Boy Mum, it was an amazing thing to read it and just see my own childhood and my own upbringing reflected in it. And I think 14 years ago, I would tell myself to, just to be conscious of my kids' social relationships. I think is a big thing. I think going into parenting as a dad, I was so excited about sitting down and watching, Star Wars for the first time with them, or taking him to the first, football game or whatever, the kind of things which are very cliche parts of the sort of the father-son bonding rituals here. But I think, just be really concerned about, all the friendships are developing and the sort of the time they're getting outside of the home and their understanding of their relationships. I think that's the thing I would say to myself. Think about that as much as about the fun sitting down and watching the same geek movies I enjoyed watching.
You can find out more about Ruth and Neil at our website, embodywunc.org. You can find all episodes of Embody the radio show there and subscribe to our weekly podcast. Today's episode was produced by Kaya Finlay and edited by Amanda Magnus and Wilson Sayer. Nina Scott is our intern, Jenny Lawson, our technical director, and Quilla wrote our theme music. This program is recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. North Carolina Public Radio is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.